Welcome, friends, to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm the producer of Good Faith and Redeeming Babel's Director of Content, D.T. Sloffman. Curtis Chang is off this week. As you know, the Good Faith Podcast is a place where friends who love Jesus help each other make sense of the world. Tim Alberta, who's become one of our friends here at Good Faith, certainly lives up to that description. Through his book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, Tim has helped many faithful followers of Jesus make sense of one of the most polarizing political landscapes in recent history, both in this country and in the church. Recently, Tim and Curtis were invited by the Council of Christian Colleges and Universities to discuss what it means to play the political long game in 2024. We brought you the first part of that conversation last week. Now, let's join Curtis and Tim for part 2 of their talk, entitled The Cross and the Sword. Here's Tim Alberta.
My dad used to he was pretty good with his one-liners. And my favorite thing I would ever hear my dad say is he would tell his congregation all the time. He'd say, folks, we are in sales, not management. Right? Your job is to sell Jesus, to sell the gospel, to sell the idea of salvation being made available by grace through faith to any of those who would call on his name. And once you've made that sale, the management is up to him. And we, I think, have become so consumed with the management that we've forgotten how to sell. Right? And that's a tragedy, because it's a tragedy on any number of levels. But I think for me, it's a tragedy working in secular spaces, living among people who are so desperately in need of the gospel. The tragedy for me is it's the easiest sales pitch in the world. Right? But we have made it so hard for ourselves. We have created barriers to entry. We have convinced so many people who would otherwise be receptive, like when I give a talk in downtown Ann Arbor, which is near where I live. I mean, Ann Arbor, when I was a kid, in my evangelical world, was compared literally to Sodom and Gomorrah. You don't go to Ann Arbor, right? And yet, I'm giving a book talk in Ann Arbor with a standing room only audience, surrounded by the sort of imagery that you can imagine in a place like that. And these folks, many of whom maybe have never heard the gospel, have never gotten the sale, all they've heard about is the management and the control and the need for power. But when they just hear the sale in that environment, they're all leaning forward, wanting to know more. So how do we get out of our own way and just let Jesus knock on that door? And that is, I think, the ongoing struggle, Curtis, for so many of us. When I think about this painting, The Light of the World, that was my dad's favorite, and I have a copy in my office now, right? Jesus is knocking, and there's no handle on the outside, right? It has to be open from the inside. He's knocking. And sometimes I envision in this modern landscape like a team of like political canvassers standing right behind Jesus with clipboards, like needing to tell them, well, let's be clear. Before you hear much more, let us give you all the details about what it means and doesn't mean to accept him into this door. If we could start stripping away all of the baggage, all of the extracurriculars, and just present Jesus, then I have to think that this civilizational decay we hear about, these Jeremiads of America's demise, we might start to see the change that we all want to see. But we're not going to see it through managing and through grasping for power and by turning to the sword. Peter tried that, right? Peter tried with the sword. And what did Even rewind it a minute. Sorry, I'm going long, but preacher's kid. It's just it's genetic. Remember earlier on when for the first time Jesus said, "Well, who do you think I am?" And after Peter positively identifies him as the Messiah, and Jesus then begins to share the divine plan for the ages, right? What does Peter do? He rebukes him. What does Jesus say to Peter? Get behind me, Satan. This same exact phrase, get behind me, Satan, that he uses with the devil in the wilderness. Get behind me, Satan. This is his rock that he's going to build the church on. Get behind me, Satan. Because just like the devil in the wilderness, Peter is all about controlling the world. You can't. No, you're the Messiah. You're going to rule. You're going to be the strong man. We're going to reclaim, we're going to make Jerusalem great again. We're going to make Israel great again. We're going to, oh yeah. Oh yeah. A little squirming in the seats there. We've got a plan here. What do you mean you're going to be killed? What do you mean? That's not the program, right? And Jesus, get behind me, Satan. And then even in the garden, when he's being arrested, this guy, the hothead, the power-hungry, he's still reaching for the sword. And Jesus is like, dude, you still not getting it, huh? Only after he's crucified and risen does this same guy who had been reaching for the sword write his epistle all about this idea of radical grace and forgiveness and compassion and demonstrating the love of God by loving the people who are your supposed enemies. That same guy. What changed? The cross, right? There's the sword and there's the cross. And that is the if you're going to package it as neatly and cleanly as you can, you want to talk about short-term versus long-term? Short-term, the sword, sure, it might win you an election. It might get you justices appointed to the court. It might get you policies passed that you've been after. And none of those things in and of themselves are bad things. Let's be clear about that. There's nothing wrong with voicing your opinion as a Christian in the public square and by advocating for policies that you see as most consistent with your Christian faith. But that sword is a short-term tool that we begin to think is our ultimate weapon of warfare. And last I checked, as a pastor friend of mine says, Jesus was political, but Jesus was not partisan. And if we become so consumed with holding on to that sword and with managing, controlling, dominating the world around us, we completely lose sight of the cross. And that is the long game to be played if, in fact, we believe that the country's headed to hell in a handbasket. If we want to save the country, it's not going to be with the sword.
I want to speak to the fact that we are not talking about here a fairy tale. We're not talking about here that is something that we have not seen in history. By that I mean a call to center on the cross versus the sword. We're not talking about something also that has not been shown to actually work in the long term in American history. What do I mean by that? Well, in the 1960s, white evangelicals might have thought, you know what, this country is awesome, let's preserve it exactly the way it is. There was a group of Christians who were like, this is not so awesome, right? This is the African-American population who was living still under segregation, still under Jim Crow, essentially in many parts. And what did the African-American church do in that moment? It chose to get involved in politics, but with a firm commitment on the cross. And the cross meant a focus on the how, not on the short-term what. The how of Jesus' nonviolence, right? Nonviolence, love of enemy, extension of grace. That was their political strategy. And any political strategist, anybody in political management at that time would have said, that is nuts. That is crazy. That will never, I mean, that literally, no one would have given that a chance in 1960, right? And yet, I would argue, and I think it's a very clear, strong argument, that has been the most potent political transformation that America has experienced in the last 100 years and beyond, really. Right? And that has not only made lives better for African Americans, with much still left to be done, but it has redeemed white America as well, with much left still to be done. So when we talk about let's play the long game by focusing on the cross, especially on the how of politics, right? This is not a fairy tale. This is not like something that we're just making up. This is something that is not only proven in the gospel, the story of exactly what Tim's talking about, it's proven in American history, in recent American history, right? So let's come back to that. Let's come back to the Jesus how found in the cross. All right, with that, let's open it up to questions. Just raise your hand, and we've got people circulating the room.
So I would say, firstly, we're Protestants before we are American evangelicals. And under a different sword, our history has been affected and shaped and formed by our Protestantism. But you're describing what I see as a Constantinian compromise. And Mark Knoll said to me one time, he said, Adam, there's Catholic history in the footnotes. The guy who wrote the book on what is an evangelical. He said, there's Catholic history in the footnotes. And he said, you know what, Adam, we're the footnotes. But I hear what you're saying about the political life and climate that we live in right now as American evangelical Protestants. You're describing the facts of our modern life. The question is this, so what, should we abandon the word evangelical? I've been in other conversations around that idea. What shall we do? How shall we live? I understand the ethic,
yeah,
but how do we public relations this, dumpster fire at the moment?
I think that's an individual decision to be made. But I will say, as someone who works in secular spaces, trying to not just tell about the gospel, but show, right? Try to live in a way and try to witness to people and try to help them understand who Jesus is and why they need him in their lives. I have found the term evangelical to do far more harm than good. And if at the root of the word is, not the root, I don't want to get into etymological debate, but part of as kids, we were rewarded if we could bring a friend from school to Wednesday night church. It was and actually in retrospect, seems like a little bit like a pyramid scheme my parents were running on us. But we were constantly being told that we are called to be evangelists. The title of the church was evangelical. But my point is that if the idea is to evangelize, if that is the verb, the action, the operative word, to evangelize, does being an evangelical get in the way of evangelizing? In my experience, it absolutely does. And I think that that's a conversation that has to be had in communities, in congregations, in small groups, in families. I would never recommend some sweeping change to a group like this or to any other group. But I do think it has to be recognized that among the younger crowds, and by the way, I would just add this to sort of piggyback on Curtis's point a minute ago. We now have a couple of decades of research of social science data to show that non-white Christians are significantly less likely to self-identify as evangelical, right? They are far more likely, if you are black, if you are Asian, if you are Hispanic, you are far more likely, 2 or 3 times more likely, according to a lot of the data, to self-identify as born again, but not as evangelical. Why? Because of the explicitly partisan cultural connotation that evangelical has taken on. To be an evangelical in the popular imagination now, fairly or unfairly, is that you are a conservative white Republican, Trump supporter. That is what it means. So on a college campus setting, in a workplace setting, if you are trying to evangelize, that creates a big old barrier to entry especially for the younger generations.
Thank you for the emphasis that you had on the generational and the long game. My name is Leah Zeidema, and I'm from Dordt University, which is in Iowa. And the reason it's relevant that we're in Iowa is it is, and has been for months, presidential election season there. And that changes things when we're talking with students about what the long game is. It's hard to have this conversation when their definition of politics and their involvement becomes voting for a president, and it's reduced to that.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, as you have this idea about sales and management, and instead of control or trying to subjugate others to our will, persuading them and being able to share the love of Jesus, how do we help students in this season, this presidential election season, think about this beyond presidential politics?
I'll take a first stab at that. I think you have to give them opportunities and models for how to be engaged in politics that is not partisan and also not about presidential elections. Because presidential elections are actually so far removed from their actual agency in the world. Like their vote is gonna, especially if you live in some states, like I live in California, my vote is like almost completely meaningless. And any young person's vote is completely meaningless. Like we've become so bifurcated and sorted out that most of our votes in the presidential campaigns are not actually a meaningful expression of agency, right? And actually most of the concerns of our lives are unaffected by the outcomes of presidential elections, right? The things that are actually what is happening in our schools, what is happening in our neighborhoods, local crime, local culture, relationships between ethnic groups in your own city. Those are politics. Those are political issues. That's what politics is. Politics is the polis, the life of the community, right? That's what and we've so made it about national partisan identities and national elections. We've lost the essence and heart of politics, which is how do we live together as local communities? That's the heart of politics. So your opportunity as a locally embedded institution, and that's what you are, you're an institution that is in a locality, is to find those problems and issues that are local, right? That require local solutions, that require local communities to come together to work and solve on those problems. Find those issues. Is it the influx of immigrants into your community? Why don't you focus on that rather than some abstract debate on border control policy, right? How do we actually welcome the stranger that's actually in our midst? That's going to require political solutions. The homelessness problem in your community. What can your community be doing? Students need to be given opportunities to see politics at that immediate level where they can actually do something and where they can be rubbing shoulders with people who actually may, at a partisan level, be very different than them, right? But they're not going to find that. It's going to be hard for them to find themselves. That is, I would say, one of the most helpful things you as a local Christian college and university can do in 2024 and beyond is create those local opportunities.
I would just add this. I have described, this is always fun. I have described politics being to the Christian oftentimes like Las Vegas is to the suburban dad, which is to say, that it is a self-contained escape where the rules of their everyday life do not apply. So the way that you would treat your neighbor, the way that you would treat your coworker, the way that you treat your spouse in your everyday life, and your own sort of personal ethics around alcohol, around sexual sin, all of those things, right? That, well, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? It's this escape. And politics has become that escape for far too many Christians, where they believe that, and in fact, I have a sort of interesting exchange where I'm quoting from a long, kind of contentious exchange with Ralph Reed in my book, where he's describing January 6th and how his dear friend Mike Pence and his dear friend Donald Trump just couldn't see eye to eye. And that they were still his dear friends. I said, hey, Ralph, does it bother you that your one dear friend was trying to get your other dear friend killed? And that wound up being a whole different conversation that we had. But the point is that when we finished the conversation with Ralph saying, yeah, but in politics, these things happen. right? And I said, well, hold on, just stop there for a minute. In politics, why in politics? Why do we create this permission structure to say that in politics, we can talk in ways, behave in ways that we would never, that would never transfer over to any other area of our life? That we adopt this zero-sum, ends justify the means mentality in politics that we don't identify, that we don't adopt anywhere else. And so I think when I'm talking with young people in particular, what I always try to emphasize is that politics, what happens in politics does not stay in politics, like the Las Vegas thing, right? That everybody can see you. So the same way that you might stop taking marital advice from your neighbor if you saw cell phone footage of him at a strip club doing cocaine in Las Vegas, your unbelieving neighbor might stop taking spiritual advice from you if they see you planting a, MAGA flag in your yard, right? I mean, we have to be very careful with understanding the ways in which our Christianity is on display in politics. And there's a great risk there, but in my view, there's also a great opportunity, because there's an opportunity when you are engaging your neighbors, when you're going out, you're trying to collect canvassing commitment cards, you're doing all these different activities, right? There's an amazing opportunity there to be establishing and reestablishing and emphasizing what your true identity is. You're not a Trump supporter. You're a Christian who happens to have made a prudential political judgment that this is the guy you're going to caucus for, but that's actually not that important. Why don't we talk about what is important, right? Again, this comes back to this idea of identity, properly and rigidly ordered. And if I'm repeating myself, I apologize, but sorry, I'm not sorry, because this is, having worked in politics for 20 years almost, this is the thing I encounter time and time and time again. I just had an email exchange the other day with a very powerful political person in Washington who was broken because of how completely inverted his identity had become, right? He had ceased to view politics through the lens of his faith, and he had started to view his faith through the lens of politics. And then when that happens, when your identity becomes backward like that, it leads to all kinds of problems. Idolatry, and hatefulness and spite and appetite for conflict and all of this. And so just getting that identity right, I think, for young people is the most important thing.
I want to say one other bit of advice, and this is going to be self-serving, but it's also serving the CCCU. So, which is, I would encourage you to check out the after party curriculum, because that is, if you're unclear what play to run, it's at least a play. Right? Get small groups. Run this through your chaplain program. Run this through student life. Have this integrated into your particular parts of your curriculum. And check out the curriculum, and you'll see it is not partisan. We are calling for an identity in Jesus apart from any political party. We don't make any reference at all to any political party, because we are calling people back to the long game.
So if you were a university president trying to play the long game, when your constituents are playing the short game, and you're wanting to reach this next generation of students and make a real difference, what would be your advice to that university president, Christian university president?
Okay, so just a short while before we came on, I was showing Curtis an email from an administrator at one of the nation's biggest seminaries. And he wrote...
With the title president in his title.
Yes, and we'll leave it at that. Yeah. And this person wrote me from an encrypted private email account for reasons that some of you might understand. And he was explaining how, having read the book, and I promise this is not meant to be self-serving, it's just the anecdote that comes to mind, but having read my book, how he was so moved to action and feeling this tension and this conflict and wanting to do something about it, and would love to put it in the hands of his students, would love to sort of build some study around things that Curtis and I sort of share, but he's not quite sure how that would go over, right? Now, the interesting thing is that I've gotten a lot of those notes, and I've had a lot of those conversations, and what's really interesting is that sometimes I've had those conversations with different people at the same place, but they're both in their little silos, terrified to pop their head up above. And one of the things Curtis talks about a lot is sort of planting a flag and just saying, look, like, we're going to take the incoming, but we're also going to extend an invitation to those around us who are like-minded. And I don't mean like-minded on a partisan basis at all. I mean like-minded on the how question. And what I would encourage people to do is to plant that flag and to do it in a way that is almost annoyingly winsome, right? Because even some of the people who are going to be upset about it, if you are able to draw them in to a gentle, humble, loving conversation about these things, if you are preaching the sales, not management approach, and if you're preaching the how, not the what approach, and if you're doing it in a really winsome way, then I think it's going to be really effective. Because the one thing that has been consistent for me in all of my travels, churches all across the country, different denominations, different, everything, a huge, diverse, wide net that I've cast. One of the things I've consistently found is that the number of people who are feeling this way, who are feeling uneasy about this, feeling anxious and overwhelmed and not sure and sort of paralyzed by this moment, there are so many of them. And yet, because they all feel sort of afraid to plant that flag or to push back on some of these forces, then it becomes this collective action problem, right? And you see that in institutions like yours. You see it in individual congregations. I mean, I share a story about a pastor up in the Hudson Valley at Goodwill EPC, the church where I was born, where this man was basically pushed to the edge of a mental breakdown because of the sort of an insurgency happening in his church, all because he had the temerity to do a couple of things. First, read a letter from a black colleague in the EPC on the occasion of Obama's election back in 2008, a letter that a black pastor had written saying to his brothers in the clergy in the EPC, saying, listen, I know many of you probably didn't vote for this man, and there are some policies of his I really disagree with, but I hope you all recognize, what an important moment this is for your black brothers and sisters. And the imagery of two little black girls running through the White House has a profound spiritual impact on us. And so this pastor thought that was a really beautiful letter, and he read it to his congregation. And that was the day he became a heretic. And for the next 8 years, there was a campaign of sustained psychological warfare against this pastor, ultimately culminating in a cabal inside of his church threatening him. And one of them even photoshopped a picture of the church on fire and circulated it around the church's social media pages, right? The church in flames, pushing this man, this good, godly, totally nonpartisan guy who just wants to preach the gospel, to the edge of a mental breakdown where he had to go to the Florida Keys for 4 months and regroup himself and wasn't sure if he could continue preaching. And you know what happened when he came back? He came back and those toxic elements had been removed from the church, and all of these people came weeping and apologizing to him because they had stayed silent. They hadn't stood up. They hadn't planted a flag. They had not provided any sort of a counterbalance to this craziness that was happening in their congregation. And that's when he realized, he's like, oh, we were in the majority all along. And we're not talking partisan majority. We're not talking ideological majority. It's not red-blue, right? It's a majority of those of us who have our identity firmly rooted in Christ, who want to keep our eyes fixed on that which we cannot see, as Paul wrote, right? Because what we can't see is eternal. What we can see, that short game, is temporary, right? 2 Corinthians 4:18. It's like that is the difference that I think we see in a lot of these settings. People are scared, but once they start standing up, they recognize how many of them there are.
And let me suggest something about planting the flag. I really encourage, in that case, say the university president, plant the flag where you have most agency and immediate trust. So that doesn't mean, for instance, that you then go make a grand presidential announcement of what you know is going to get misunderstood, misinterpreted. Like, start where you have the most circles of trust and plant the flag there. Like, who's your direct reports? Why don't you have a book club and read Tim's book together? right? As a community, and say, what do we think about this? Or if you want, have that group take the after-party course together and see, do we think this is right for our students, right? So start where you feel like is safest, but you do have to plant the flag somewhere. You have to come out of hiding, because it is precisely the fear that has gripped, I think, so many that Tim describes, that gives us this illusion that actually, we're outnumbered. By we, I mean people, exactly what Tim's saying, people who are trying to follow Jesus first.
Yeah, I'm curious your thoughts on kind of both our public posture as university profs and leaders and pastors and everything else, both our public posture toward and our relationship with the church, and specifically how we sort of walk this line of the honesty you're talking about, of the very public and real failures of Christian leadership at times, and then the reality of the fact that most of the pastors, most of the churches around us, the people that we know and are working with, are doing really good work. And the average, especially young pastors that I know, don't want anything to do with this sort of, pledging allegiance to Donald Trump from the pulpit kind of mindset that some evangelicals have gotten into, particularly because I think, we are influencing and teaching the next generation of church members and church leaders. And what we don't want is this posture of criticism and critique to be their default as an excuse to just phone it in on the church, right? Because they have this responsibility for leadership for the next generation. So I'm just curious your thoughts on how to do that well, to be really honest and to say there are real failures, there are things we need to apologize for and repent of, there are places to disengage from certain structures and that kind of thing. And yet there is a beauty in the continued influence of the average believer in their neighborhood, in politics, in their churches, and all of those things.
Great question. And let me just start by saying I don't know of a formula. That's not to say there's not one, but there's an interesting story that comes to mind. So many of you are familiar with Rachel Den Hollander and her work exposing and combating sexual abuse and sexual abuse cover-ups, particularly in the SBC, although she works with a number of other churches as well. And she told me this story, and she actually undersold it. When I went and did the research myself, she actually undersold how dramatic this was. So there's a large SBC church in Mississippi that had a pretty awful sexual abuse scandal come to light. This is probably 3 years ago or so. And what most SBC churches had been doing and how they'd been handling these things was just it was creating this self-perpetuating downward spiral where people inside the church could see it, people outside the church could see it, and it was driving more and more people away from the church. What this church did was it adopted an approach and some practices that were so radically transparent that even Rachel and some of the people around her were like, are you sure you want to do that? Right? What they did was on the landing page of the church's website, they itemized everything that had been alleged, everything that they'd been able to confirm, notes from the pastor on their role in the investigations, why they believed the allegations were credible, dates, documents, the whole shebang, right? And when it happened, they lost a bunch of members. But then something really interesting happened. All these new people started coming into the church. And pretty soon, they had gained as many members as they'd lost. And then a little while after that, they'd even risen above what their previous membership levels were, and they're still rising to this day. And I think, again, this is not a formula, but it's, I think, an example of how radical transparency, radical accountability, and radical honesty can serve a church community and set an example for the next generation that, look, we are not perfect. And yet we follow the one who is. And if you are able to talk about walking a fine line, right? That is the ultimate fine line, is trying to tell not only your people, but the community around you. And the fascinating thing is there's a reporter who, I'm forgetting his name, who has really been on the front lines of documenting all this ugliness inside of the SBC. And he went down and saw this for himself. And he wrote this amazing story about, like, this is unprecedented. Like, I've never seen a church do this. And suddenly, you've got all these people in the community who had never even been inside of a church. And they wanted to come check it out, right? And so it is setting an example for that next generation. But it's also, I think, opening doors to the outside world and demonstrating that that while we are not perfect, we are trying our very best to be accountable to the one who is. That's, and that might be as good as, that's it's not perfect, it's not across the board, it's not universal. But I think erring on the side of that accountability and that transparency and that truth is a pretty good place to start.
Tim, thank you for your book. It had a profound influence on me. I wept through it every bit as much as I did through Christina Dumez's Jesus and John Wayne, except with yours, towards the end, I started weeping with hope because of some of the stories that you were telling of this taking the stand, taking the hit, taking the attendance hit, and then recovering to a much more genuinely Christian community. I'm wondering if I could just put a little frame around that for us. I don't know if either of you have got an advanced copy of Michael Emerson's new book, Religion of Whiteness. He's former CCU faculty member and provost now at Rice University. And it's a group of Christian educators got a chance to get together with him in October and hear his research. It was just devastating. Just his absolute, utter, beating it down. There is no such thing as Christian nationalism. There's only white Christian nationalism. And just in, just research question after research question, this exposing a religion of whiteness that's at the front of this Christian nationalist movement. In a conversation afterwards, kind of a round table with Michael Cara-Powell from Fuller Youth Institute, I just brought up the question because we had just gotten some encouraging news about there were Christian colleges across the country from, not many of them were CCU schools, but there were a number of Christian colleges who had actually grown that fall. And we had this really disturbing conversation about how the same factors that are at work in a pastor being tempted to give in, to keep attendance up, are working on our Christian colleges to be tempted to give in to white Christian nationalism to keep our enrollment up. It was a really heavy conversation, and it was hard to argue with by putting a finger on the schools that just had happened to grow that year, that they were, let's just say they weren't schools that were known for their inclusiveness, or schools that were kind of place that you'd want to go if you were a person of color. So how do we not, this is kind of a double question here, how do we not give in, help our enrollment people not give in, to just kind of go for the easiest market and accidentally become more and more schools of where religion of whiteness rules? And how do we make things right as much as is possible with us, with our black and brown colleagues and students, in that we have already given into this in 1,000 different ways in our history?
I have a difficult answer to that question, but it's the answer that I've been giving to pastors who have been asking this. You're right to point out it is a very close parallel temptation that's in place here. So it's the same answer I've been giving to pastors, which is you may have to get smaller. You just may have to get smaller. Now, there may be ways that the Rachel Denhollander example would be great, that actually, this radical faithfulness, radical accountability leads to actual numerical growth. Fantastic if that happens. But you have to at least be willing to get smaller. Because what this is a moment of judgment, not only on political idolatry, but also all other forms of idolatry, including the idolatry of success, defined as size, scale, growing endowments, more buildings, and so forth, which pastors struggle with their own versions of all those exact same things. So all institutional leaders of Christian colleges and universities and of churches, this is a moment of reckoning for us of, are we willing to follow Jesus even if it means giving up the idolatry of growth, size, scale, success? And I would argue that there's a lot of reasons to actually consider that as an opportunity, not a cost. Because when you actually look at how well we have actually been forming the next generation, certainly I know the church world the best. I won't make a judgment about Christian colleges and universities, but the statistics are quite sobering in terms of the actual depth of formation that our current model, which so prioritizes growth scale, is doing. And it's understandable, because if you are going to prioritize growth and scale, it puts you on a certain business model. It means you've got to actually, I'll speak as in a church setting, right? It's a very programmatic model, because that's a program scale. You do a program which can be staffed by a small number of people with a large user base. That's the economic model for growth and size. So it's heavily programmatic, much less relational. And I have to tell you guys that in the church world, and I think this is true in the Christian college world, programs do not form people. Programs do not form people. People form people. Relationships form people. Mentoring forms people. Those things don't scale in terms of the business model. They scale in the long term for the kingdom. They are the mustard seed that grows to replicate 1,000-fold, right? So we've got to play the long game. And I think if that means willingness to get smaller, but actually more potent in terms of formation, we have to be willing to entertain that. And that freedom will both free us from the temptations to actually make these sort of sacrifices to play the short-term growth. It will also free us to be more creative, I think, to develop new models that prioritize relational, life-on-life discipleship, formation, transformation.
I truly believe that Mark 8:36 is not a rhetorical question. It is Jesus looking you and me in the eye and asking, what does it profit you to gain the whole world yet forfeit your soul? So to Curtis's point, if that means that your enrollment shrinks by 50%, but you are true to your identity in Christ, then that's cause for rejoicing.
Shirley, with that, you have the last word.
Wow, it's always good to ponder the intersection of political engagement and Christian responsibility with Tim Alberta. Maybe one of the questions Tim and Curtis answered spoke to something that you've been curious about. If so, let us know about it. You can connect with us through our website or by leaving a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. We want to hear from you, and those ratings and reviews help others find us. Thanks for listening and supporting our work. I'm D.T. Sloffman, reminding you to come back and join Curtis Chang again around the campfire.